Welcome to It's a Small World, the local impact of global challenges of climate change. This is the first of our three sessions on community and environment justice. We are joined by three incredible panelists who are scholars and champions on this topic. Today, we will discuss the complex challenges of global climate change and the economic and social impact on vulnerable communities around the world. We will also explore the possibilities of using restorative practices addressing environmental injustices in communities here in the US and abroad as a global movement. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank our conference sponsor, Open Society Foundations, and our event sponsor, AgVisor Pro, for supporting our 2023 World Conference. Restorative practices are about alleviating social imbalances. We live in a world today where the people and the systems that are responsible for producing food for humanity are under pressure to produce much more than they're able to with far few resources than they need. AgVisor Pro's mission is to provide them with tools that connect them to expert solutions, answers, and technology in order to better integrate our agri-food chain. AgVisor Pro gives us confidence to agricultural decision makers to help farmers improve profitability, make agriculture more sustainable, and enhance global food security, one question at a time. The environmental and social consequences of this are transformative, and it is why their values and mission align with those of the IIRP. I encourage you to visit the AgVisor Pro exhibitor booth and website at getagvisorpro.com. That's getagvisorpro.com to learn more about the wonderful work they are doing. You can also visit Open Society Foundation Baltimore at www.osibaltimore.org/restorative practices to learn more about the incredible restorative practice work happening across the city of Baltimore. So let's begin. I want to start by welcoming you all to our session. Please put in the chat where you are joining from. So take a few minutes to do that. Tennessee, California, Northeast PA, the Poconos, Adams, New York, Vermont. Hey, Vermont, wonderful. Dallas, Texas, Baltimore, Maryland, Toronto, Brazil, Eugene, Oregon. Wonderful. And so as you're doing that, I want to go over a few housekeeping points. So we would like to encourage you to participate actively in the chat. It's a great way to build network community and to create dialogue. When you do, be sure to select all panelists and attendees. Remember that closed caption is available for this session if you choose to select it. And language interpretation is available in Spanish, Portuguese, and French. Please share your questions using the Q&A button. That's very important. It's going to be very hard for us to get the questions out of the chat, so please use the Q&A button located on your Zoom panel, and we will address them at the end with our panel discussion. And importantly, we really hope you enjoy this session. Let's meet our panelists. I want to start with Audrea Lim. Audrey, if you can turn your camera on, that'd be great.
Hi.
Hi, Audrea. Audrea is a renowned Brooklyn-based journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Harper Magazine, The Guardian, The Nation. She is also the editor of The World We Need, Stories and Lessons from America's Unsung Environmental Movement at The New Press. I'm a huge fan of The New Press, a wonderful boutique publishing company who also sponsored our 2022 World Conference and is a sponsor of our educational events going on during the conference. She is visiting scholar at the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU, a 2022 Artist Fellow at MacDowell, and is currently working on a book for St. Martin's Press about the commodification of land in America. Welcome, Audrey. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about participating.
Right. Next, I want to introduce Professor John Gillroy. He's a philosopher, professor, and founding director of policy design programs at Lehigh University. Professor Gillroy was also an original member of the Academic Advisory Committee for the IIRP when the graduate school sought initial accreditation. That's wonderful. His specific expertise issues are in comparative and international law, with an emphasis on environmental and constitutional issues. John's work translates whole philosophical arguments into policy paradigms to compete with traditional reliance on methods like cost-benefit analysis. In terms of environmental and climate change, he recently authored the essay Ecosystems, Policy and Law, a philosophical argument for the anticipatory regulation of environmental risk, and finishing work on the second volume of his 3-book project to illuminate the origin, current dilemmas, and constitutional future of the international legal system. Welcome, Professor Gillroy.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.
Great to have you here. Finally, I want to introduce Professor Brunilda Pali. Professor Pali is currently assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands, affiliated researcher at KU Leuven, Belgium, and adjunct professor at Vermont Law School and graduate school here in the USA. Vice chair of the board of European Forum for Restorative Justice, co-founder of the multidisciplinary collective, The Voice of Nature, institute led by environmental artist Maria Lucia Cruz Correa, and founding member of the non-for-profit organization Leuven Restorative City. She publishes extensively on gender, critical social theory, and restorative environmental and social justice, culturally and critical criminology, and arts. She has co-edited the Critical Restorative Justice, Hart Publishing in 2017, Restoring Justice and Security in Intercultural Europe, Routledge, and in 2018, and the Palgrave Handbook of Environmental Restorative Justice, Palgrave 2022. Welcome, Dr. Pali.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So it's great to have you all here. If I can have you all just put on your mutes for now, and we'll get started. And I'm going to start with you, Audrea. So if you can take about 3 to 5 minutes to help us understand what is environmental justice and why is it so important right now to this audience? And what is the biggest or most common misperception about environmental justice?
Okay, thank you, Keith. So to me, environmental justice as, a movement and a way of just looking at the world, I think it's really important in 2023 because it really highlights how, the big issues that environmentalists care about, like pollution, climate change, environmental health, ecological destruction, these affect some communities much more than others. And, of course, the big disparities between who gets to live in clean, safe environments versus, who gets stuck living in smoggy, polluted places with like no access to fresh food. These disparities tend to run along, racial and economic lines. So, Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and poor communities tend to get the short end of the stick. So environmental justice is important because, in the wake of Black Lives Matter and the movement at Standing Rock, we as a society are beginning to acknowledge that our economy, our political system, and really like nearly every aspect of our society and our world, from the education system to the way that we purchase homes or like what opportunities we have to access outdoor recreation, like all of these things are rigged in different ways against people from some of these communities, these like marginalized communities. So I think as we begin to address the environmental issues and the climate crisis that, affects everybody of like across all demographics, it's really critical that we recognize that our relationships as individuals to all the different institutions we deal with, whether that's like the oil corporation that's in our backyard or the environmental agency, like the local DEP or EPA agency or whatever, it's really our relationship to these institutions really differs depending on who we are and where we live. And it's really critical that we recognize this so that we can try to fix it or at least change the situation. And we're not just like transporting these old exploitative, uneven relationships into like whatever new world we're trying to create. So I think the most common misconception about environmental justice is that environmental justice groups and environmental justice communities, that all they want is like, they don't want that oil development or waste incinerator or highway or whatever in their backyard, that they're not in my backyard, NIMBYites, you know. And I mean, they usually don't want these things, you know. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe didn't want the Dakota Access Pipeline running through their sacred lands. You know, Black communities don't want a trash dump down the street. I mean, nobody wants these things. I don't want these things in my backyard. Probably you don't want these things in your backyard either. But, you know, because these environmental justice communities are just constantly dealing with like an onslaught of corporations and government officials trying to like plop the dirty, stinking facilities that nobody wants in their backyard. I mean, we just hear about them saying no to all these things all the time. But what I think is one of environmental justice's most important contributions, actually, for us as a society right now in 2023, is that, you know, because our current system, our current like economy and political system has like tended to leave these communities behind. You know, environmental justice communities are like not the ones that tend to be thriving on oil or like industry profits or like Wall Street investments or whatever. Because the system hasn't really worked for them. Many of them also have a practice of relying on one another and their community far more than, you know, upper income Americans living in gated communities, for instance. They rely on each other a lot more to meet their needs, you know, whether that's getting like fresh, healthy food or just like aid and help after a major storm. And also, like, many of these environmental justice communities are also connected to older traditions and ways for meeting basic needs like food, shelter, whatever it is. And, you know, some of these traditions are from other cultures or other countries, or, you know, these are indigenous traditions that emerged here on the native soil that we like reside on right now. And these models often happen to be very good models or systems for reducing, you know, our carbon footprint. You know, they involve less consumption, less waste. They're a little bit more decentralized. They're more communal or collective in their approach. It's kind of exactly the kind of thing that we might need right now. And, you know, these are ways of doing things that might seem visionary and idealistic, and, you know, maybe they are, but for a lot of these environmental justice communities, they adopted these models or created them because it was the pragmatic thing to do. You know, they happen to be extremely good ways to meet their communities' basic needs. So I think learning from environmental justice communities in the movement, I mean, there's just like a lot there for us to learn from. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Audrea. That's really sets the stage for what you shared around this topic. And listening to what Audrea just shared, in a few minutes, what are your thoughts, Professor Gillroy, on what Audrea just shared? Same question.
Well, actually, I guess what I'd like to do is pick up where on two of her points. First, the idea of changing relationships. And second, the NIMBY idea. I did quite a lot of work on NIMBY and many different solutions to it in the United States and Canada. But I think, you know, instead of the detail, what I'd like to say, just to set up what I guess I'm here for, is the idea of law and policy, and that law and policy matter. I think law and policy basically is the system we have, for better or worse, that changes these relationships or sets these relationships in cement. It also is the one that decides on NIMBY situations who gets what. So being and participating and understanding that is important. And I guess I just have like 3 points I'd like to make. The first is basically that law and policy matter, but we have to define our terms. I consider law and policy to be basically an ongoing effort to refine our relations with one another, to build on what Audrey said. Moral, political relationships, economic relationships, social relationships. And they're based on basically seeing contradictions and trying to eliminate those contradictions. And the main contradiction that I'm thinking about is the contradiction between is and ought. The idea that what is not what ought to be, which is a number, which I think maps onto a number of things that Audrey just said. Also, I think we need to understand that the law and policy is an ongoing process of refining ideas over time, refining relationships over time, and it eliminates some contradictions. And with the elimination of some contradictions, it creates new ones. And then we have to turn and face those. So it's an ongoing thing. It's not a one-off or an on-off switch. It's more like a rheostat than an on-off switch. Second, I think we need to remember these are large-scale interdependent collective action problems. Climate change, or what I prefer to call the greenhouse effect, on the one hand, which is the prominent environmental risk issue that we're still facing. I'd like to say something about that a little later, but that environmental risk and environmental justice are interconnected. It's fundamentally, I think, a misunderstanding if we think we can extricate one from the other and just treat one, because they interact, and making changes in one makes changes in the other. And so we have to basically be able to, to look at something individually, but we need to be conscious that these things are intertwined, they interact. In the philosophical language, they're dialectic. They interact with one another and push one another, and the balances between them really determine the relations, determine who gets the awful hazardous waste site. Third, I don't think this is the first instance. I think we should think of this as a series of instances, matters of human justice and matters of justice in nature, or matters of the integrity of nature, the functional integrity of nature, and the moral integrity of humanity. And I was thinking that, the world has faced a number of these situations. Just to make an isolated example, in the United States, I was thinking of two eras, the progressive era around 1910, when we had many human justice problems in terms of pandemics, in terms of squalor, in terms of urban situations. And we had also, this was the dawn of the environmental movement in the United States, in terms of both of public lands and of pollution. And the second one is much more recent to us than the 60s and 70s, when we had both a civil rights movement and an environmental movement working together or not working together, but being issues at the same time and trying to balance the two. And then lastly, I'd like to just give a thumbs up, or at least an acknowledgement to the fact that in the end, for both these eras, law and policy had to be employed to at least start to address the problems, the evident ones. Of course, they produced other ones, but and I'm thinking, in the progressive era, that's when we created the Forest Service. That's when we created the National Park Service. That's when that was the first urban zoning laws were put up there to alleviate problems within cities. That carried on through the Depression and the Dust Bowl, where environment and human justice issues interacted with one another. And then, of course, in the 60s and 70s, we had the Civil Rights Movement, which was crowned by the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, just to mention two. And environmentally, we created the EPA and had the Clean Water and Clean Air Act, which was the first time we comprehensively tried to address what were before that treated as sort of private nuisance problems. And for the first time, we looked at air and water pollution as public health issues and as national collective issues. So, basically, those are the four things that I thought I needed to say about this. And I think in the end, though, what we're talking about here is the fact that law and policy is an important concept to empower more local solutions. I mean, to take an educational example, which I know the IIRP is very, it's very important to the IIRP. If you're working in a classroom, you have a much higher probability of success if the principal, if the teacher, and then the principal, and then the superintendent, and then the school board, and then the state board of education, and then I don't know, the federal Department of Education. But if you have law and policy behind you, if you have law and policy that can support and empower what you're trying to do. Otherwise, you waste a lot of energy trying to fight situations or fight structures that, as Audrea said, are maybe calcified or out of date.
Thank you, Professor Gillroy. And let's get Professor Pali in here. I'd like you to respond to briefly to both points that Audrea and Professor Gillroy just spoke about.
Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, I would like to start by just making a very short point about terminology. So there are different terms that accommodate different conceptions of justice, and environmental justice is a term designed to deal with and to center justice for humans most of the time. Ecological justice, for example, centers justice for ecosystems and biospheres. We have the term species or multi-species justice, which kind of centers justice for more than humans or other than humans and plants. And finally, we have the term, circulating term of climate justice, which deals with climate change and the associated injustices of that. Nevertheless, I think from what I heard and from what Audrea and John were saying, and I think our intention today is to move beyond this kind of disciplinary or terminological limitations and be more encompassing, I think, in our diagnosis, and also more imaginative in our envisioned responses. Nevertheless, in all the terms that I mentioned, I think there is one word in common which is crucial for us today, and that is the word justice. So in other words, the ecological decline has widespread justice implications for humans, non-humans, and for the living ecosystem itself. And that's a really important point I'd like to make. If we think about the climate change, for example, at the core of it, climate change is not just a crisis of greenhouse gas emissions and temperature rises, but it's also a matter of injustice. And the truth is that across the world, those least responsible for climate change are actually suffering most of the impacts of it with the fewest financial resources and the least access to decision-making power. So it is exactly this imbalance and our collective failure to rectify it that actually constitutes climate injustice. So the reality is that, in a way, people and places most burdened by climate change are often physically and temporarily distant from each other, from those that are most responsible for creating it. And in my view, these sort of unequal impacts and injustices of climate change are creating new global and intergenerational relations of responsibility, of course, while intensifying those that already exist. And so these new relations of responsibility, these involve people, communities, and institutions of global south and global north, are, I think, insufficiently acknowledged and addressed by conventional legal and political processes. If we think of indigenous people, for example, they are most acutely victimized by climate injustice and by environmental conflicts in general, because of the disruption and the loss of intimate relationships with non-human beings, with community and with land that this causes. And these victimizations are also, in a way, exacerbated by already pre-existing structural inequalities. So I think we need ways and means to express, explore, and act upon these unequal relationships and responsibilities that are involved in such issues. Another point I'd like to make that is this is a most invisible form of violence that is experienced mostly by indigenous people and also people in the global south, which is seldomly talked about in environmental justice literature, is what I would call epistemic violence or epistemic injustice. And this happens when people's lived experiences and perspectives are dismissed, are devalued, are misunderstood, are misattributed, and appropriated by, let's say, the dominant knowers and knowledge systems. So in a way, it's not just a matter of socioeconomic inequalities, but it's also a matter of, domination through cultural values and worldviews, which is at stake. And this lack of respect for the environment and for local knowledge on behalf of governments and corporations, I think it's a serious concern because it can create great harm to traditional people's ecosystems and animals involved. So if we think of the example of nature, it's a seemingly easy concept we can all relate to, but actually it isn't. The nature and natural resources are radically perceived by different stakeholders in environmental conflicts usually. So for a company, they are materials from which their products will be made and from which to make a profit. For a state, nature is national resource, so that they can lead to economic development. Whereas for indigenous population, they are intimate part of their lives and cultures, elements from which they do not even feel separated and which they respect. They wouldn't even speak about something like nature because they are conceiving it as part, they are part of it. So they have no even imagination of talking about it in that way. So I think that also this kind of different perspectives, they draw upon multiple knowledges and lead to contestations, to divides, to fundamental divides. And therefore there is also a need for approaches that enable this kind of more collaborative knowledge-making, epistemic dialogue, if I may call it. Perhaps just to make a final point, and why are these topics relevant for our audience? Well, first of all, because I think it concerns us all, whether it is individually, locally, globally. I think this is a sort of a matter of fact. Second, because I think as restorative scholars, advocates, and practitioners, I think we can mobilize our field in the service of environmental justice. And I'm convinced that restorative justice offers a range of values and practices to support the sharing of multiple perspectives and knowledges. For example, epistemic repair, we can talk about epistemic repair, which could be the restoration of conditions for trustful, collaborative knowledge making, which would also enable diverse cultural, emotional, and spiritual values to be expressed. And it's important to keep in mind that neither, a simple retributive response or restitutive response could actually have any meaning in an epistemic context. So that's why I think restorative justice actually has a lot of potential. And finally, the point I was trying to make before, I think restorative justice does have the means and the ways of expressing, exploring, and acting upon these unequal relationships that I mentioned and responsibilities that are involved. So it is up to us to highlight, the structural inequalities and the disproportionate impacts on marginalized communities and to act upon it.
Thank you, Professor Pali. And I want to get back to the point later on about, approaches using of restorative practices and restorative justice as we wrap up. I want to come back to you, Audrea, and as a journalist and an activist, what are the long-term consequences to our planet and to people if we don't correctly address system complexities to climate change? I mean, what should we expect?
Yeah, that's a very complex question, but I think that a very simple way of thinking about it is that, if we don't address the system complexities, then, just think about all the crappy social issues that we're dealing with right now as society, whether that's over-policing, poor environmental health, housing insecurity. If we don't address the system that is producing all these problems, well, these things are kind of just going to get worse as climate change progresses, like not better. We've already seen how the pandemic created chaos for, just take our food systems for like one example, how it disrupted our food systems, our supply chains, nearly crushed our healthcare system. Climate change is just going to stir the pot even more. It's already creating a lot of chaos for cities, regions, states. You know, it's taxing our emergency relief systems already. It's going to render entire neighborhoods of cities unlivable. It's going to, you know, roast or flood what was once really good farmland for growing food. And I think, to Professor Gillroy's point about like interconnectedness, how, yeah, it's useful for us to look at single issues, you know, food security or I don't know, flood management or whatever, but they're all interconnected. So we have to deal with them and address them in an interconnected way, and that's what the system complexity is all about. So with mainstream climate discourse, you know, there's a lot of focus on just carbon emissions, you know, how much carbon we're releasing into the air. Obviously, this is extremely important. And, you know, if we don't drastically cut our global carbon emissions, you know, we're going to see habitats and ecosystems continue to collapse. We've already got biodiversity of species that are already collapsing. You know, we humans are just going to keep getting hit with like harsher storms and droughts and wildfires at a much, much faster rate than we're feeling it now. But like carbon emissions aren't the only problem. There's like a whole other interconnected set of issues. Like take, for example, cars. You know, it's part of how we kind of got into this mess, our thirst for like diesel and gasoline. But it's not just cars. You know, American cities are now built for cars. Our cities are like encased in concrete. And I think I've read that like in the average Western city, around like 40% of the land is dedicated to cars. So that's like parking spaces and roads. It's just like a wild amount of acreage. And so just like switching consumer products from like gas powered cars to electric vehicles is not going to fix this much bigger problem. Like I live in Brooklyn and I bike around the city. That's how I mostly get around. And even on like a regular hot summer day, this is not even to speak of the heat wave days, which are just going to get harsher and harsher. You know, when I bike around neighborhoods that are like the poorer neighborhoods where more Black and brown people live, there are often no parks, there's no trees, there's no grass, there's no greenery. And, you know, you can like smell the melting tar from the street. And, you know, I'm wondering, are my tires going to burst? Am I going to pass out from the heat sitting at this intersection? From the heat that's like radiating back from the concrete. And, you know, in those moments, I always think to myself, like, we probably can't continue to have entire cities encased in concrete and just dedicated to cars. Like, I think to climate proof our cities, we might need to get rid of some of the roads, and that's going to have like a ricochet effect on everything that happens in the city. So similarly, I think if we don't like address the housing system that we have now, which is one that treats housing as a commodity rather than housing as a human right, we're just going to see more evictions. We're going to see more displacement, more houseless people living outside, except that now they're going to be living outside during brutal heat waves and like 100-year storms. Or if we like don't shift away from a food system that's controlled by big corporations, then we're just going to see more supply chain issues that we saw during the pandemic. Or actually just like forget about the pandemic, like let's talk about eggs, right? That's the problem right now. Or if we don't come up with better ways to keep our community safe, besides just like straight up policing, then, you know, when people's mental health is failing, when people are desperate because they can no longer afford food or housing, well, you're just going to see more policing then, you know? Yeah. But so one other thing I just wanted to mention to address something that was in Keith's question. You asked what happens if we don't correctly address the systemic problems that are causing climate change. And I would say that there's probably, I don't think there's like a correct way to address them. And I believe, I feel like it would benefit us to get away from the idea that there is only one solution or a set of solutions or any kind of blueprint. Like there's a lot of, you know, as Professor Pali said, there's a lot of different kinds of local knowledge, traditional knowledge out there that's specific to groups, specific to like whatever environment that group, that community lives in. And, you know, I mean, as a society, we're going to have to try a lot of things. We're going to have to screw up a lot along the way. And we're just going to have to try to do a little bit better each time. I mean, if you look at, for instance, like the different environmental justice communities and all the different visions they hold, the different models they have, you know, tried to adopt for addressing social problems, like whether that's like restorative justice or food cooperatives or community land trusts or community-based whatever, you know, many of these alternative systems, I guess, that they've adopted to deal with basic needs, they share similar general traits. You know, they're more communal or collective, they're less wasteful, less based in just like consumption. They aren't oriented around profit, but the details are very important, and not every system or model is going to work for every community in every situation, or even in the same way as the neighboring community. And I think that letting go of this idea that there's like a correct solution is also an important thing. It's something that our society and our politics, like we also, I think, need to change that conception. Like we don't want to repeat the era of like the federal government raising entire Black and brown communities to build federal highways and create an entire continent of like suburbs, an entire culture revolving around cars, for instance, right? That was like the federal government has like a single vision for everywhere. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
No, I mean, you raised an excellent point about a single solution source, right? And I want to get Professor Gillroy in here, particularly around your work, but in about 3 to 4 minutes, tell us about the alternative paradigms then that are core to solutions orientation to some of the things that Audrea just raised. And then we're going to get Professor Pali in here to talk about, to expand on those points. So what are some of the alternative paradigms?
Well, I mean, one of the big contradictions about being a human being is that we are faced with unbelievably complex problems and have limited self-consciousness and limited consciousness with which to absorb them and figure them out. And so, I found, I found initially when I was in the policy and legal world that people operated through paradigms, basically sets of assumptions, sets of theory, which I think sort of what I was talking about here in a way, but and the problem there, which maybe I'll talk about a little later, is that people have a tendency to be taught specific paradigms, specific sets of assumptions and axioms, and then figure they can apply them. The idea that, if everything is a nail, all I need is a hammer. And so, I mean, this is especially true in public policy schools, where market assumptions and cost-benefit analysis are basically the coin of the realm. But the real point here is to simplify without losing what's really at stake, without losing touch with what's really at stake. And I think that we need to invite all kinds of people to create all kinds of paradigms and to bring them to the table and talk about them and work through them, and also through the policy process. Policy is about persuasive moral argument, and there are a number of I've spent most of my career converting Enlightenment arguments, medieval and Enlightenment philosophical arguments, into policy paradigms, so they can be applied differently, and so we can see what the different definitions give to us. But I mean, if to narrow it down to my perspective on this, it's that we really have to move from considering instrumental economic values as the core of what policy and law is about, and move to the idea of intrinsic values, and then to explore, to expand on that. Intrinsic values not only connected to humanity, but connected to nature, the functional integrity of the environment, as well as the moral integrity of humanity. And this would allow us something that I think speaks to the idea of, what are the consequences? I mean, because we're living the consequences. So we're already living the consequences. But I don't think that should discount the idea that, it's 60 years ago when climate change first became, a matter of fact or a matter of scientific fact. We were still in a basically market mode. We were looking for responsive policy. We were letting markets make a lot of decisions that have given us what we are now living in. And I would think that we didn't use anticipatory policy then, but I think we really, that shouldn't discount us thinking about how these different paradigms, how people's different sets of assumptions might allow us to anticipate some more of these problems and act before the fact. That's one of the main problems with environmental risk. Its stealth, its latency does not allow really for you to go back and repair something afterwards. You have an aquifer and it gets full of some kind of toxic or hazardous chemical. You're not cleaning that out. You're not going to be able to clean that out and restore it to its. So you have to think about it first. And this is where I think that what we really need to do is we need to have all the different dimensions of what it means to be human talked about in terms of policy paradigms that can be brought to the table, that can be analyzed. I mean, I've taught this kind of thing now for many years, and I've had students do all kinds of paradigms. I have a scheme that they use, all kinds of paradigms applied to all kinds of issues. And some of the interesting things are when 2 or 3 students take the same issue and approach it through different sets of assumptions, you get different realities. But I'd say like the baseline here, because my time is coming out, but the baseline is that there are 2 big distinctions here. And I think that's between seeing policy and law and environmental justice and climate change as questions of instrumental value or questions of intrinsic value. And I think we should be conscious of what our trade-offs are. Are we trading the instrumental, the instrumental or intrinsic value of humanity against the instrumental or intrinsic value of nature? And what kind of transaction does that mean? But I think this is how you simplify. I mean, we have to simplify, but this is how you simplify without losing touch with the kinds of things that would give us more variety. And I think, and I want to support that idea because one of the things that I've fought my whole life, or my whole career, not my whole life, I guess I was 10 before I started thinking about this, but my whole career is this idea that there is one way of doing this, or there's one set of assumptions, and there isn't. There's tons of them, and also we can look not only forward but backward for some of these assumptions. Some of the definitions of humanity and the person, and some of the definitions of the natural order are ancient or are our past. And also, I think we shouldn't discount that, because these people who wrote these philosophical arguments have put together a lot of the complex variables for us. They've gone through the thought process. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have different ideas of social contract. We have different ideas of humanity and the person. We have different ideas of what practical reason is. We have different ideas of what human moral agency and the functional integrity of the environment require. And it's a huge inventory of thought that I think is ignored most of the time by policymakers. But I do think that's that we're living. It's not really consequences, it's living. And now what we're really trying to do is, can we anticipate and adapt so that it doesn't get significantly worse? That's what we're really talking about.
Thank you, Professor Gillroy. I want to pick up on a point and go to you, Professor Pali. The diversity of being human, that really resonates with me. The diversity of being human in a complex world and systems that are complex. Professor Pali, you've presented on several panels and podcasts about environmental justice, environmental harm and crime, and the emerging concept of environmental restorative justice. What are your thoughts about the diversity of being human and the other points that Audrea and Professor Gillroy just shared?
Yeah, so indeed, when I started working on this idea of environmental restorative justice, what could that mean? I realized that we have advanced when it comes to the regulatory and protection side. I think that cannot be denied. There is also a growing ecological consciousness, which, for example, youth movements or environmental activism also testifies to. And yet, if we really look well, I think we are still unable to develop meaningful accountability, justice, and repair in these cases. So that is completely missing. And most of our sort of current legal and regulatory approaches have become, in a way, normalized as the only way to do justice. And we seldom stop to ask, are we actually asking the right things from our processes of justice for the environment, let's say. So if we think of, for example, responses to harm and wrongdoing, I think we can distinguish them by the object of emphasis. So, for example, retributive justice focuses on perpetrators' offenses, restitutive justice focuses on victims' losses, but then restorative justice or reparative justice, however we want to call that, focuses more on the relationship among all of these. So perpetrators, victims, communities, environment, and so on. So to me, the environmental restorative justice challenges then this kind of justice as usual approach and asks us to take the relevance of relationality in the aftermath of harm and wrongdoing seriously. So essentially, let's say a restorative ethos or praxis, if we can call it, to environmental harms calls our attention to two things. I think the first one is the necessity to repair the harm that has been done already to its humans and also other than humans, communities, but also future generations. And the second thing is, and how can we move on from there to build different relational and ethical systems that prevent future harm? I think these are very central, objectives. The term itself indicates two things. So one way to approach it could be to think, how can environmental agenda contribute to restorative justice? Because this is also interesting for our field to develop. And of course, the other side of it is, how can restorative justice be used in the context of environmental harm? And having said that, I think it's important to acknowledge that environmental harm and injustice do raise specific conceptual and practical challenges that are not present, or let's say that manifest differently in other domains where restorative justice is used. For example, sexual violence or child harm or things like that. This is completely different. There are different challenges here that we have to face. Another point, which I think has been mentioned by both speakers, is that the environmental restorative justice cannot be understood in a vacuum, so it needs to be understood within and to find an appropriate niche alongside already existing initiatives for addressing environmental harm and inequalities. So it can learn a lot from environmental protection approaches, from environmental activism, and so on. It can draw from them and there are approaches that have already embraced restorative values. Nevertheless, in doing that, it needs to also develop a language and principles and practices of its own. So if I'm thinking of what can environmental restorative justice and contribute to, like if I can very easily schematize that, I think first of all is the ability to respond to a very broad spectrum. So when we look at the justice system, they deal with crime. If we look at environmental activism, they have more the language of injustice and so on, or conflicts. Restorative justice is not theoretically, of course, sometimes services are limited to a certain place, but the approach in itself is not limited. So we can address environmental harm, we can address environmental conflicts, we can address environmental crime, and so on. So there is a lot of space for restorative justice to operate. The second most valuable contribution that we make, I think, is this kind of creating of a safe and structured spaces and processes for all stakeholders to exchange different views, hold difficult conversations around what has happened, what must happen in the future to ensure accountability, repair, and no repetition, let's say. The form and space of such processes will change. So it can be, I think we have to be very imaginative. Nothing like that exists yet. So we can talk about restorative circles, restorative assemblies. We can go more in the line of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, restorative conferences. And if we are talking about regulation, we can even talk about something like restorative inspections or restorative licensing, so we can be really imaginative there. But whatever the form of these processes, we always seek to provide space for respectful and honest conversations between members of different communities. This dialogic element is very, very important in this field, especially. Why? Because it has a great potential to reduce distance. Distance is not just physical distance, but I think distance is one of the reasons why some environmental harm takes place. So it can be a distance conceived in from traditional or community ways of being and living with nature and the environment. It can be distance created by experience. So those who profit from causing environmental harm are physically, and very often temporarily distant from those who experience it, and so on. So distance in space, difference in temporality, distance in experience, and so on. And I think we have a big role there to close that distance, because that distance closing also can reduce the domination in the future. The third point I'd like to make is that another gift that restorative justice brings is the fact that we prioritize the notion of repair. This is not a common notion. It's not often emphasized in such cases, but in cases of environmental harm, just focusing on punishing the perpetrator, for example, a pollution or destruction of natural resources, is completely meaningless if there is no consequent repair of the damage that has been done, or repair of relationship, and if there is no reassurance that this will not happen again. So that's why a lot of activists look at the justice system, but they forget that that system is so limited in what the system can do. And then, of course, to just conclude, because I think this is very often confused, restorative justice is confused for a very soft approach. I think we cannot focus on repair without centering accountability and responsibility in our justice responses. So to everyone who tells me, because I hear often students who say, oh, but I would like the perpetrator to restorative justice is not a soft option. Accountability for what has happened and responsibility taking is central. So I think that is a fourth element that we need to emphasize in our approaches.
Thank you, Dr. Pali. Professor Pali, I'm sorry, Professor Pali, thank you so much. I want to, in the interest of time, I want to leave some time for questions that will come your way. We have a lot of probably questions that are going to be in the Q&A. And in this final question to you, before we do a closing, I want to pick up on the point about what do we as individual groups or industries need to inspire more people to embrace restorative justice and the field of restorative practices in the movement for environmental justice. I want to pick up from your point, Professor Pali, what you were talking about and to Professor Gillroy's point about reducing distance and inspiring more people, right, to look at it from this framework. And I want to start with you, Audrea, from where you sit. What is the role? What should be the role of journalism and activism under this umbrella of restorative justice as part of the environmental justice movement? And then I want to ask you next, Professor Gillroy, what should be the role of higher educational institutions in terms of this need for internationalization as a spark for globalization when it comes to this? And then Professor Pali, I want to end with you around embracing research. What does the role research plays in this? And let's start with you, Audrea. If you could take just like a few minutes to wrap up this final question, and then we'll go to you, Professor Gillroy.
Yeah, I think, for both activism and journalism, activism does a lot of things. Activists push for change. They, the kind of like law and policy changes that Professor Gillroy has talked about, that they can either empower, or what did you say? They empower or support communities, or I mean, they can like also make communities' lives a living hell. So it's really important to push the needle. And, you know, as Frederick Douglass said, you know, power concedes nothing without a demand. So that's a really big role for activism. But I actually think that there's one way in which activism and journalism do a similar thing, which is that they push new ideas out into the world. And a lot of the things that both Professor Gillroy and Professor Pali have been talking about, a lot of these are like the paradigm shifts, different ways of thinking about how to solve problems. These are like what we need are they're cultural. It's cultural change that we need. And so, you know, journalists provide context and explain difficult ideas. Journalists can draw on, you know, Professor Go was saying we can look to the past actually for some of these alternative models, these different ways that people have thought about dealing with justice issues or approached whatever problems. You know, we can look to so journalists can connect the dots between the past and the present. They connect the dots between different movements working in different areas, whether that's like housing here and food security here. I think for activism, I think there's this idea sometimes that activism is only important when like activists win their campaigns, but I don't believe that at all. I think that even when they seem like their demands are like impossible or really idealistic, pie in the sky, you know, I think they're extremely worthwhile because they do what some journalists also try to do, which is like push new ideas and demands in the world. And they make us as a society question things that we have taken for granted our entire lives. And, you know, other people in the world will pick up these ideas in ways you might never imagine. You know, it's like one of the beauties, I think, of being a human being living in society. I mean, I'll give you some examples, like Black Lives Matter and the defund the police, abolish the police sort of demand. Whatever you think about those demands, like, was that movement a failure because some cities have like expanded their policing budgets? You know, some people would say yes, but I would actually say no, because that movement really forced a lot of Americans to consider that there might actually be better or different solutions to our social problems than just policing. You know, problems like people experiencing mental health crises, people not having a place to live, people just being poor. You know, I think that policy can be changed overnight, or, you know, within a few years or whatever. Budgets can be cut or expanded like kind of overnight, but like cultural change, institutional change is like really slow, and you're not always going to see the effects of activism for a long time. Or let me just give you one more example. And then I will.
Please do. Yeah.
Occupy Wall Street from like a decade ago. Did that achieve anything? I don't, if you remember this movement, the movement was all about like, we don't make demands. We don't have any demands, you know, we just, it's like the 99% versus the 1%. It's just anti-capitalist, no demands. So yeah, of course it didn't achieve anything in terms of, you know, getting its demands met. But, you know, the people who took part in that movement went out afterwards and started a million progressive leftist radical magazines that now like populate our conversations with like different kinds of radical ideas or progressive ideas that we had never talked about before. Occupy Wall Street like introduced the idea of, yeah, the 1% versus the 99%, which is like, you know, that we still use that language today, 10 years later. It put the issue of, I feel like it put the issue of debt on the table. And we are now, like a decade later, starting to see like federal action maybe with debt cancellation. It's kind of, I've seen people compare Occupy Wall Street to the Velvet Underground, the band, where it's like the Velvet Underground was, you know, when they were playing initially in the 70s, you know, they're weird, nobody really understood them. They were obscure, not very many people listened to them. But then like everybody who listened to them went out and like started their own band, like Nirvana or whatever. And so that's how cultural change happens. So I think that's how both activism and journalism are important. They put ideas into the world, and once they're out there, they're just out there, and people will do what they want with it.
Wonderful. And I want to pick up on that and come to you, Professor Gillroy, putting ideals out in the world. Speak about that from the role of higher educational institutions, both globally and here in the US. And take a few minutes to do that. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure. Actually, I think that the academic world is the place where those ideas are either legitimized or not in a very essential way, which is both positive and negative. I was thinking when Professor Pali was talking about the importance of repairing harm, you can't even start repairing harm if the policymaker you're talking to doesn't understand what harm is. He doesn't think harm is separate from cost. It's just a cost. It's another kind of cost. I once had a tremendously long argument. I presented a paper on harm to humanity, harm to nature. And all the questions I got from this basically cost-benefit crowd were about terms. Why do you use harm? Harm just clouds the issue. That's just an excessive cost. No, it's not an excessive cost. It's a qualitative difference, a negative qualitative difference in someone's life or the life of an ecosystem. But if they can't understand the vocabulary, then you're really in trouble. And I think that my problem with academia, especially with public policy programs, professional public policy programs, is that they have basically accepted the idea that there's one way to do this, and they teach then and legitimize that one way to do it to such an extent that it's very hard. It's very hard for students when they get into the policy world to actually bring in more of these ideas, even if they're exposed to them. And I think that this is a really important part for academia, in the sense that it's a bad metaphor, but a toolbox. Again, I think policy schools should be much more open to teaching different paradigm ideas. That's what I've been trying to do, off the radar here for quite a while. But I also think that that the new ideas thing is very important, and that public policy, law schools, even law schools, the predominance of law and economics, and trying to force these things into this box that that values things only instrumentally and not intrinsically. Whereas we have other options. Excuse me, I'm sorry. We have constitutional options that could talk about this in terms of rights. We have statute and administrative legal options that could talk about this in a variety of ways. But I think that that the fact that academia has not bought into the plurality of paradigms or the plurality of idea structures is a real problem. I've created 3 policy programs that try to do the opposite. All of the and I've drawn some very interesting students who've gone out now, and they're doing very interesting policy and real. In fact, I'm bringing some of them back and to do a handbook, using their experience, so that other people in policy can utilize that. But I think it basically is this idea that that academics should be about dialectic. It should be about everyone coming to the table with a piece of the truth, not handing you a truth and as the only truth, but everybody coming to the table with part of the truth, with the idea that through dialogue, through interaction, through trial and error, you get a wholer truth. I don't think that's the right word, but a more perfect truth, a more three-dimensional truth. And also I think we need to think about words as having more than one definition or connotation, I guess. Diversity can mean what's unique about you. Diversity can also mean what you bring to the common idea of humanity. I think that we need to talk about that in terms not of just of systems of refining these ideas over time, so that there is so that the what we teach people adapts to what's changing in the world, and the requirements of the world without losing these core ideas like the functional integrity of nature, the human integrity, or moral integrity of humanity, and let that change, let that refine itself over time. But again, I think that's the biggest problem in academia. And one of those things, I mean, I promised that I wouldn't quote philosophers because I do that too often. But the last thought that I had was about Hegel, the German philosopher, the German 19th century philosopher. And he defined law generally as the essential appearance of inherent ideas. So he saw law, superficially, law is a system of external constraints. But for Hegel, it wasn't. It was the manifestation of what the internal essential idea or of a principle was. And I think that, the idea, his idea was making human reason real in the world, and that law was a tool for that. Just that little change from looking at law as just a system of constraints to reflecting ideas that are changing and that are developing, I think would make a big difference in academia, because Lord knows we could certainly. I don't. Again, one last thing. I don't think this is student resistance. I mean, I have not had a whole lot of student resistance to working through new ideas. It's much more that you have a professional kind of structure, and also the number of economists who've gone into public policy, but that's another question. But I think I think that we would not. I mean, everyone's afraid of losing students, of losing enrollment, of doing these things, but I don't think that's really an issue. I think that there would be a response. I've always had a positive response to my little programs. I've always had some very interesting students and very interesting groups of students. So I think that academia needs to sort of wake up and open its eyes, and because it is a legitimizing tool, and it needs to have a wider idea of what's reasonable to legitimize.
Right.
And I think that's I think that's what I'd say about academia.
Thank you, Professor Gillroy. And Professor Pali, I want you to bring us home here with this final question before we go to take a few questions from the Q&A and then close this session. Just in terms of just quickly, just like how significant, what's the role of research in all this? When we talk about the integration of restorative practices into the environmental justice movement.
Yeah, so research for me is very important, especially if we want to continue developing this environmental restorative justice agenda when we are sharing insights, ideas, experiences, and also where we are learning from other disciplines. Research is here crucial. And I think it's through research that we, in a way, build knowledge that is both courageous and imaginative, but also informed and realistic, that is feasible, that really maps into the real world. So there is the research. I'm thinking research is a very broad term, and then we can think about the term research as serving very different purposes, and I think they all have their own importance. So I wouldn't like to, say this is the best or this is the worst. But for example, I think we can use research simply to build normative foundations, develop common and recognizable principles, a common language for this new agenda, and so on. I think that's also part of research. We can use research more descriptively to systematically map what exists. So right now, we have moved a little bit forward, but a few years ago, we didn't know what's happening already in the field. And now we know that there is experience in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand. Already there are restorative conferences in environmental harm cases. So we know that through research, that has mapped that and has studied that. We can also conduct research that is evaluative, so we can have, some kind of an idea of what a good way of doing something is, and then we can look at practice and see, is that how it should be, or what are the problems with that practice that exists? So I think that's also a way of thinking about it. We can do comparative research. I think that's really important to understand so the different contexts, different countries, different legislations, different policies, and so on. I think that's also really important. And then we can also develop action research, which I think is a little bit what John was talking about. So action research, collaborative research with practitioners or with policymakers, where in a way we create a new practice and we evaluate or study it as we are doing something, and then we change it again and so on. So we adapt in a way the knowledge and practice as we go on. So that's also an interesting way to think about. And finally, we can use research to try and unpack the specific conceptual and practical challenges that I mentioned before are raised by environmental harms and injustices that are not present or that manifest differently in other fields where restorative justice has been used. And I don't have time to go into this, but for example, responding to complexity, so environmental conflicts are very long-term, they are embedded in socioeconomic inequality. So this challenge is an important challenge for research to unpack. Can actually restorative justice services unpack that complexity? Can we work with that? Another challenge that is raised, I think that is a new challenge from this field, is how do we identify, how do we include in our restorative practices the perspective of more than humans, future generations, nature, whatever that is. So this is different. So far, restorative justice has been done from a very anthropocentric perspective, so now we have to change that. So how can we do that and so on? So that is also something that research can answer. Another thing that I think we need to take very seriously is how are we involving corporates? Very often corporates are going to be the offenders, so we don't have very often experience of working with corporates. If there is no pressure from activists, if there is no court cases, pressure by the courts, and we are to engage corporates in restorative processes, how are we going to do that? How are we going to force them to accept accountability and so on? So this is also something that we need probably to go step by step through small projects that are very localized with corporates, perhaps that are willing to start. And then, so corporates also is a very big term. I think we have to dissect that term a little bit and, think that there are huge kind of recidivist offending corporates, and there are also locally embedded corporates that I think would be very ready to actually engage in restorative approaches. So these are some of the challenges that I think research can also answer in this field, and which are interesting.
Thank you, Professor Pali. And we're at the very end of our session, so I want to thank you all for taking the time to respond to these questions. It's been a really, really healthy conversation and a level of discourse that I think I believe has given our attendees some language and some questions to take with them around the complexities of how we do integrate restorative justice, restorative practices into the environmental justice movement. I'm going to invite Claire to just send me a few questions. We're going to take a few from the Q&A, and then we'll wrap up this session. So Claire, could you just give me one question? I'll direct it to the panel.
Yes, thank you. There are several questions, but I believe you have been addressing most of them. I would just like to focus on the interest from a couple of people that sent questions on the applicability of restorative justice and whether or not is harm reduction applicable to climate change. And just to give you a little bit of context, the question says, the speakers use the word harm. I read articles about the approach of harm reduction for addressing substance use and community violence. Do you consider that harm reduction is applicable to climate change? So I'll leave you with that.
I'm going to direct that one. Audrea, why don't you take that 30 seconds to tackle that one, and then Claire, I'd like to get another question in before we go for Professor Gillroy and Professor Pali.
I'm not sure I should take that one, actually. I feel like I don't.
Or I'll open up to either one of you. Anybody on the panel, take a stab at that. Like in 30 seconds or 45 seconds. I know we don't have a lot of time, but who would like to tackle that question?
Well, for a second, I mean, I think harm is applicable in almost any issue. Again, though, this sort of contemporary, what I call positivistic approach to research academia to scholarly methods basically wants something that's definitively classified. You know, nothing is worth anything if it means more than one thing. And this is one of the reasons why scientific method in human affairs is not really transferable, because in the world of human beings, concepts overlap, concepts change, they refine themselves over time. You have to be cognizant of that, and also you have to be cognizant that a particular term may have one definition with climate change, one definition with environmental justice, another with with the penal system. I mean, again, this is this idea that there's a difference between dialectic and heuristic thinking. And scientific method has a tendency to push heuristic thinking, where there is one classifiable definition of something. And we have to resist that. I mean, if we got back to the idea that, you don't come to a fight with the truth, and then basically our argument is a negative thing where somebody, where one person lives and one person dies, or one idea dies, or we should see it much more dialectically. We should see it much more cooperatively, in terms of the idea that we all come to the table with part of this. And so if you have an issue like the question asks, does harm apply here? Well, you come to the table and you say, I might be able to see harm applying in this way, but not this way. Somebody else might say, well, yeah, but you're not taking this into consideration. It's not a cost. It's qualitative, not quantitative. It's about intrinsic value, not instrumental. And from that, everybody comes away with a much more complex idea of what these terms can mean and where they can be applied. It's like what I've gotten in my career is people saying, well, I'm sorry, that person was dead 100 years, so he or she couldn't possibly have anything to say about what we're going through. Well, yeah, I think they do, because we're still human beings. We're still wired the same way. We have more complex, and maybe now we should have an absolute right to transportation, or an absolute right to web access that wasn't even an issue 200 years ago. But that doesn't mean that the ideas and definitions are different.
Yeah, thank you so much. Claire, I think we have time for one before we close the session.
Yes, thank you, Keith. Let me open it up so I can do justice. I think this question encompasses some of the other questions that came up later, and just take a second to acknowledge the engagement, the passion, and the mutual caring on the conversation that is happening on the chat. So thank you so much, community, for being present and being here. What arenas of law and policy provides the best leverage in protecting vulnerable populations and restrict the self-centered interests of corporations and self-entitled privileged nations? State, federal, international, or other areas of law?
That's another big question. I'll invite Professor Pali or Audrea to for 30 to 40 seconds, just briefly address those. Either one of you can, or you both can.
Yeah, Audrea can also try that one. Well, I think there is not one. I think all of them are necessary and important to where it's local law, national law, federal law, international law. We need all of them. What I am excited for at the moment is the idea that there is this kind of more innovative law, for example, earth law, rights of nature law, which I think has a lot of connections with restorative justice, exactly because it tries to be a kind of a cultural or paradigm change in law, and it kind of pushes us as humans to move away from a right to exploit. Because if you look at law, the way we talk about the environment is really as a resource for us to exploit. And that is in every law that we have built. So this, the rights of nature movement and the earth law, the wild law movement, I think they are trying to shift that relation between from the planet and the humans towards the idea that humans are only part of the planet, and therefore we need to have a duty of care, not a right to exploit. So those are a little bit revolutionary movements in law. I think they are also attracting a lot of women, a lot of young people that are also finding difficulties to kind of fit into the more classic, traditional, mainstream law approach. So there are a lot of activists also here that have, in a way, also reached restorative justice. So they are asking us, because they also see restorative justice as some kind of a paradigm change, you know, when it comes to justice. So we have been interpolated by this movement, and I find them the most exciting movements for the moment. These are the same people that are also pushing for ecocide to become a law. So there are also ways in which we can think of how can restorative justice, you know, collaborate with them. Another movement that is interesting, you know, this is kind of climate litigation, but that's limited because it's not kind of trying to change the paradigms. It's just, in a way, pushing the corporates, and that is also very important. So I'm not in favor of saying that that's not good, that's not good. I think they are all very, very important from very different sides, to even if it's to just push corporates, that's actually a lot. So climate litigation is also interesting, and we can also find paths for restorative justice to enter, you know, to do climate litigation differently in a way that also has restorative elements.
Great. Thank you, Professor Pali. I want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank Audrea Lim and Professor John Gillroy and Professor Brunilda Pali for joining us today. And thank you for attending. Also, thanks again to our conference sponsors, Open Society Foundation and AgVisor Pro, our event sponsor, for the generous financial contributions to the conference. Remember to complete the survey right after this session. Also, check out our on-demand session, community exhibitor booths, and research poster sessions located in your attendee hub. Please join our small group conversation immediately following this session if you want to continue the conversation that you were having in the chat. This is an opportunity for follow-up discussion about this session. Brilliant minds, passionate hearts. May peace be with you, and thank you again for your time to our panelists, and that ends our session for today.